In need of a good read or just want to keep up with the books everyone's talking about? NPR's Book of the Day podcast gives you today's very best writing in a pocket-sized show. Whether you're looking to engage with the big questions of our times or temporarily escape from them, we've got an author who'll speak to you. Catch today's great books in 15 minutes or less on the Book of the Day podcast, only from NPR.
Hey, it's Tali, here to tell you about the podcast Israel Story. Now, more than ever, Israel is a tough topic. Some love it, others hate it, but Israel Story offers a nuanced, faithful window into the extraordinary stories of everyday people in Israel. Beautiful and ugly, tragic and inspiring, ridiculous and heartwarming. Check out hundreds of timeless episodes in their back catalog or dive into the 65 Wartime Diaries episodes capturing slivers of life right now. Hear voices from soldiers to survivors, farmers to rabbis, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and connect with this complicated, amazing place. Hosted by Mishi Harman and produced with the Jerusalem Foundation and the Times of Israel, find Israel Story wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Every week, I ask Jewish authors about 5 books in 5 categories. We'll hear about 2 Jewish books that have impacted the author's Jewish identity. We hear about 1 book, not necessarily Jewish, that they think everyone should read, a book that changed their worldview. We'll get a peek into what book the author is reading now, and we'll get to hear about the new book they've just published and how it came about. Today, we'll be talking with Jessica Elisheva Emerson about her new novel, Olive Days. Rina Kirsch is a young mother and modern Orthodox Jew in Los Angeles, but a contradiction burns at her center. Rina is an atheist. She is also stymied in her life and marriage. Hoping to reinvigorate their relationship, Rina's husband convinces her to partake in a night of wife-swapping with other Orthodox couples. Rather than preserve her marriage, however, the swap plunges Rina down a heady path that begins with a rekindled passion for painting and culminates in an intoxicating affair with Will, her married art teacher. Rina must decide if it's worth sacrificing everything she's ever known to fully inhabit the uncharted landscape unfolding before her, one where her needs take precedence. Jessica earned her MFA in creative writing from Antioch University in Los Angeles and her BA in journalism from USC. She lives with her husband and children in the Sonoran Desert. Jessica will share what changed for her after reading The History of Love by Nicole Krauss.
As I read The History of Love, I thought over and over again, I've never read a book like this. The love story is inseparable from the Jewishness of the book. And that made me think really differently about my own art and the stories I wanted to tell and how I could tell stories from within my own community.
We'll learn about a book that was transformative for Jessica, the book Homegoing by Ya Jesse.
It covers such a diversity of life experience and the ability for people to find joy in the most dire circumstances and the ability for evil to exist even in places of joy. It's extraordinary.
And Jessica will share the impetus for how she wrote about her main character, Rina, in her book Olive Days.
I wanted to really show a woman who I think is invisible to much of the world, even sometimes within her own community.
That's all coming up next. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jessica. I'm really excited to talk to you. I really loved reading Olive Days. I felt like your writing was lush and the characters were so fully inhabited. It was just like a complete world unto itself. I was hoping you could summarize the plot for our listeners who haven't had the honor of reading it yet.
Sure. Well, it's not a spoiler to tell you that the inciting incident for the main character, Rina, it happens on page 1, is that her husband, she and her husband are members of the Modern Orthodox community in Los Angeles. They live in Pico Robertson, and her husband asked her to participate in a wife swap in the community. And she ultimately does it, sort of begrudgingly, but she consents and she does it. I think she was already in a bad marriage. She was already having an identity crisis. And this sort of sets her on a path of self-discovery. And ultimately, when her husband really pushes her, he's very good at pushing her into things, pushes her into taking an art class. He thinks she needs a creative outlet, and she probably does. She meets and falls for her art professor at this community college. He's a Mexican American. He's from outside of the community. He also has a young child. And the book is really their obsessive love story. And each of them are kind of on their own identity quest.
There's so much in the book here that we could talk about. I'm excited to. I want to understand what led you to tell a story particularly around belief, fervor, desire, agency, like those kinds of themes. What took you there?
Sure. So I think that all of my writing is about women's desire. And I sort of have this perspective that there have been, for a long time, many women writing incredibly about women's desire. And we could all keep writing about it every day forever. And it would take hundreds of years to level the playing field from the way male desire has been portrayed and dissected and lifted up in culture. And so I am always interested in writing about women's desire. There were other themes, I guess, that came very naturally to me. I myself am a practicing Jew who does not believe in God. Sometimes people will say to me, it's kind of audacious, actually. They'll hear me say that and they'll say, oh, you don't mean you're an atheist, though. Like, you're agnostic. And I'll say, no, I'm an atheist. And I bake challah every week and I go to shul and I'm happy to dig into that. So there's also this idea, the character Rina, who's very unlike me in many ways, is moving towards non-belief at the beginning of the story. And that was easy for me to access. And it's important to talk about people on the spectrum of belief in the Jewish community. So those two themes came pretty naturally to me. I also like thinking about the containers that people choose to have on their own lives and ways that that can be enriching and ways that that can be detrimental. And for Rina, the community and halakha, Jewish laws, are containers that help her and beautify her life in many ways and help her organize it. And in other ways, for this particular character, I don't think for everybody, are detrimental. The actual way I found myself writing this particular story is that not long after I moved to the Pico Robertson neighborhood where I used to live, I heard a story about a wife swap in the community. And I sort of leaned way in and said, go on. And I asked this was a person who hadn't taken part in it. He was a young unmarried friend. And I said, do you have anybody who I could have coffee or lunch with and talk more about this? And he said, why? And I said, I'm a writer. And I did have many conversations. I don't think it's endemic in any way. I just found my way into some people who had this experience, but it sort of stuck with me and went through a few iterations before I landed on the character of Rina.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Potok.
It follows a boy as he grows up in what's actually a fictional Hasidic Haredi community in Brooklyn, New York, in I think the 50s. And he is an innate artist. And as he grows, he loves art. He goes to museums. And his mother, even though it doesn't fit in with the paradigms of their society, helps him to incubate this. She recognizes something in her son. And ultimately, he creates art that's extremely anathema to the community, including nudes and including sort of the big piece he creates in the end that I think it's called Brooklyn Crucifix. And it's a portrait of his mother. And there's, a lot of fallout from the fact that a kid from this community created this art.
So tell me a little bit about why you chose that book.
So I'm a Chaim Potok stan, first of all. I read almost all of his books in childhood and then reread many of them and finished reading the rest of them as an adult. So particularly with My Name is Asher Lev, I could have picked a number of books, but I think as a writer and as an artist, this one really, really spoke to me. It piqued my interest, first of all, about Jewish traditions that were not native to me, but it's a story about identity and it's a story about beauty. And if you read Olive Days, it's probably no surprise that I'm kind of a Chaim Potok acolyte because tradition versus modernity comes into play in my story in a really different way than it does in Asher Lev.
Do you remember how old you were when you read My Name is Asher Lev, or what brought you to that book?
Yes, I don't want you to think I'm too precocious because I read books probably at ages that I would have gained even more from them if I waited later. But I was probably 8 or 9 when I first read Asher Lev. My parents had a marvelous rule that I could read anything that I picked up, and I think that somebody had recommended that I read The Chosen, which was Chaim Potok's probably most famous book, and I loved it. And then I looked at all of the Chaim Potok books on my parents' shelf and I read the backs of them and I picked the one that most spoke to me. And so it was the second book I read before I even read the sequel to The Chosen.
What do you think it was that spoke to you at that age that made you keep coming back to it?
Well, first of all, art on paperbacks, whenever these paperbacks were printed, was pretty rad. It was like photoreal paintings, and I found there was like a path in through the cover. But reading on the back about this boy who wanted to create art, and I even actually have a memory of reading. I think that the book opens with a very powerful first person section. It's like, I'm Asher, my name is Asher Lev. You've heard of me. I'm that famous artist that everybody's talking about. And so I think I remember reading the back and thinking, oh, and I was an artist as well. My parents are so generous. I had studied also art in high school. And when I told them my plan was to go to college and study print journalism because I wanted to write for a living, they said, what about your painting? Which I hope that I'm as generous of a parent as my parents were. But I was also an artist and drawing and painting and sculpting a lot as a child and just, working with materials. And so it appealed to me. And then I do sort of have a memory of opening the first page and being drawn in immediately by the voice. I mean, images from that book are just burned into my mind. And in fact, in my teenage years, long after I'd first read it, I would try to do a thing that happens not uniquely in this book, but drinking hot tea with a sugar cube between your teeth. And I couldn't make it happen. And I remember speaking to elders later and them saying, it doesn't really work. But I was just so convinced because his parents do it in the book that I must be screwing it up, that there was definitely a way to get it right. And I remember the imagery of Asher waiting in the window for his father to come home and the walks that he would take with his mother, and walks with my mother was something I could really relate to. I spent a lot of time walking with my mother. And so there were these paths into the story for me that were extremely relatable. And it took place in a time and a world that I had never seen and was dealing with themes that I probably couldn't even articulate yet, were themes that were going to be extremely meaningful throughout the course of my life. I think it's a relatable story in a number of ways for people who practice art, and probably for people who are in lives where they feel in some way trapped by aspects of their life that they also find to be beautiful or meaningful.
On Death, Sex, and Money, we feature interviews with you, our community of listeners, getting honest about uncomfortable things.
I developed an illness where it isn't safe for me to drive. A friend once said to me, sex is like air. You don't think about it until you're not getting enough. This is a similar sort of thing if you just replace sex with driving.
Listen to Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, The History of Love by Nicole Krauss.
So this is a book that's not told linearly. It's a book that's tied up in the Shoah and the Holocaust. And it's about a young man who is in love with a young woman who he becomes separated from and spends the rest of his life trying to find. And when he can't find her, tries to find her son. I don't want to give any spoilers. And ultimately, it's a story, a multi-generational story about the enduring power of love that unfolds between this old man and a young girl who, for her own reasons, is trying to find this old man.
And where were you in your life when you read it?
I was living in Los Angeles. I'd have to look. I don't know when it came out, but I would think that I was post-college. And it had come into my mother's home. I was home in Tucson for a visit. I lived in LA, maybe for a book club. It was already in paperback. And I remember thinking, and this is not a nice or charitable thought I have, that's a bad name for a book. That's what and so I picked it up. It was like, sitting on her couch or whatever. And I thought it was a bad name for a book. And I picked it up and I read the back and I thought, I don't need another Holocaust story in my life. A lot of uncharitable thoughts happening for me at this moment. But then it was sitting out for this 5 days or whatever that I was on a trip. And I pick up books. That's sort of what I do. I always have a book with me at all times. And so I picked it up and it took me like 2 minutes. I mean, 2 minutes. And before I'd even finished the book, I want to say 2 minutes in, I remember already thinking like, Nicole Krauss is a genius. She's a literary genius. Everybody should be reading this book. And then I thought, how come I haven't heard of this book yet? Which is often a thought I have if I haven't heard. There are so many things I haven't heard of, but when I come across them, I'm like, oh, why didn't I know about that? And I read it in probably two sittings.
What made this book stand out to you?
I really think the language and I like language. I like it on the sentence structure. I like it word by word. And this is a story that's about storytelling. So there is a meta element to it, but the way language is used. I remember when I was first falling in love with my husband and we were in like a place of writing each other long letters, we were all wrapped up in each other. And I would send him excerpts from books. And I probably sent him more excerpts from History of Love than any other book. Every book is unique, but sometimes you read a book and you say, oh, that reminds me of this, or this is a great iteration of this method of storytelling. And as I read the History of Love, I thought over and over again, I've never read a book like this.
Aside from being this incredible masterpiece of fiction,
right.
What made you select it for this particular category?
So I think I read it at a time where I was filtering my own identity and shaping it. I was beyond sort of the reach of my parents and the foundation they had given me, and even beyond campus organizations and college, and making a Jewish home. And this book did not have a direct impact like on ritual or how I was running my life, but it did something interesting for me. I like love stories. I write love stories, often obsessive love stories. And I don't necessarily think of those through a Jewish lens, or I didn't before the History of Love. The love story is inseparable from the Jewishness of the book. And they're one and the same thing. It's not just a love story about people who are Jewish, I don't think. And that made me think really differently about my own art and the stories I wanted to tell, and how I could tell stories from within my own community, and how I could talk about the things that I wanted to talk about in writing and have it be not a separate thing from my identity.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, Homegoing by Ya Jesse.
I can't think of a singular other book that impacted me as much as this book. I think everybody should read this book. It's remarkable. It's told over probably 8 generations of people that all descend from these 2 sisters in Ghana. Where the story begins is during the slave trade. And ultimately, it takes us to contemporary times in these 2 lineages of these 2 women. And there are all sorts of things I could say. It's about women, and I'm interested in the stories of women. It's about complicity, and that's it. We should all be thinking about what we're complicit in. It's about home, and in some ways, I'm interested in writing about home, and certainly in writing about place. It's about racial injustice and the evils of slavery, and we could never immerse in those stories enough. And particularly in North America, we have a duty to immerse in those stories. But also, it's just an extraordinarily beautiful story that gave me access into lives that I didn't have any other means of accessing. And it covers such a diversity of life experience and the ability for people to find joy in the most dire circumstances, and the ability for evil to exist even in places of joy. It's extraordinary.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Plain Song by Kent Harif.
I'm reading lightly now. This was a hard question because when I'm writing a first draft, I read pretty lightly. But right at this moment, I am very slowly making my way through part of a plain song trilogy. It's called Benediction, but the first book is called Plain Song. And Plain Song, I have a good origin story for me. My husband and I got married in a bookstore, the last bookstore in Los Angeles. And about a year after our wedding, maybe, we were celebrating our anniversary with some very dear friends. And she's an art curator and he's a rabbi. And I found myself at some point wandering around the bookstore with this very dear friend of mine, Rabbi Adam Greenwald. And he picked up this paperback, Plain Song, and he held it out to me and he said, "Have you read this?" And I said, "No, I've never even heard of that author." And he said, "There's so much Torah in this book that's set in a fictional town in Colorado." And so I bought it and I read it immediately and then I reread it. These books are about ordinary people, often in sort of hard scrabble lives. And these books elevate the ordinariness of a day-to-day life and view it with a certain, I think, holiness. I don't know that Kent would have said that. I am about a third of the way in to Benediction, and I already don't want it to end. And, in some books, you just want to read to the end. Sometimes I even have to read ahead and then go back. And this is a different experience. This is one of those books where I'm already feeling so sad that it will end and I'll be out of this world.
Book 5, the author's latest novel, Olive Days, by Jessica Elisheva Emerson. So this is a book that I think reads differently to insiders, outsiders, however you are characterizing what insiders and outsiders are. I'm just wondering how you sort of approached that. How much were you thinking about that when you were writing it for the various audiences?
So in my first draft, I tried not to think too carefully about it. I tried to sort of channel other books I've read that are set in unique cultural settings and how I experienced reading them and get it all on the page. When I went back and edited, I had to be very careful because I don't want to speak down to readers and I don't want to slow either the plot or really on the sentence structure. I don't want to slow the work down. And so I had to make careful choices about what I explain or define and what I assume the readers will get from context. And then some things I just had to let go of. Like in Pico Robertson, a lot of Jews call it the hood, like the neighborhood, but the hood. And I assume some readers, I don't explain that in depth in the book, a little bit, will say I wonder why they call it the chud, and that's how it is. And you just have to let it go. But on a larger level, I was thinking about, I hope they recognize themes from their own lives. And that could happen along a number of metrics. And one of them is I've heard from other readers who are from not Jewish communities, but other religious communities that they grew up in, and they recognized aspects and they really enjoyed filtering it through a different perspective. So I think in a larger way, there are ways that people find their way in, and it doesn't have to be through the religious aspect. It could be through the obsessive love aspect or the identity quest. But I do think that there are different paths that people can sort of access the religious and the cultural pieces of the story.
I wanted to ask you about belief in the story. I think all of the characters sort of have various Jewish backgrounds, right? Like Rina grows up in a modern Orthodox community. Her husband is a Baal Tshuva, or someone who comes to observance later in life. Anshel is ultra-Orthodox. And none of them really believe in sort of a classical sense of what you would assume for people in this community. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so it was important to me to have characters that represented a spectrum of belief. There's also a non-Jewish character, Will, who he's a Mexican-American, and his older brother was very involved in the Chicano movement. And this had a huge impact on him. And he grew up a Catholic, but he feels like it's a colonizer's religion. And even though he appreciates the beauty in it, part of his identity issue is this something I need to shrug off? And how can I sort of maintain the pieces that are important to me? So I think that there are people thinking about belief in a lot of different ways in this story. And I would actually argue that Rina's husband, David, probably comes the closest to what you might think of as a classical belief. And when Rina and David met, he's becoming Baal Teshuva. He's making this choice to be a son of the commandments and to become more religious. And she is just in the nascent moments of non-belief. And in that way, they're both sort of on ellipses. And I think that when they meet and when they fall in love and decide to get married, they're in maybe a very similar place. And that's what goes so well for them initially. I think there's an incredibly rich diversity of religious life within Judaism. And I think there's an incredibly rich belief spectrum. And I wanted to bring that out in the story. And I think that a lot of anomalies happen for people. Rina is a person who's really been on a path towards not believing, is for the most part still an observer of the commandments, and strays from a lot of moral and ethical choices that we might think would be in line with Jewish values, and yet has a lot of trouble, particularly towards the end of the story, breaking too far. There's like a bridge too far for her eventually that she comes to. And the other interesting thing about Rina is, I think as Will learns about Judaism through the lens of Rina and being in this relationship with her, she rediscovers some aspects of Judaism that are extremely beautiful that maybe she had intentionally forgotten or left behind or decided not to engage with anymore. And I also think that's an interesting story, because I would imagine that's relatable to a lot of people. When you see part of your own practice through the lens or through the prism of somebody else's experience, you can sort of have a rediscovery.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, there's a scene early on where Rina is offering feedback to an artist who she meets, and she asks the artist, "Can you define what you're trying to evoke?" So I wanted to ask you the same question.
Can I define what I'm trying to evoke? Well, that's so interesting, Tully. Nobody has asked me that question before or really honed in on that scene. I want to provoke people to think. And like I said earlier, I'm always concerned with women's desire. In this case also, I wanted to show an invisible woman. I wanted to really show a woman who I think is invisible to much of the world, even sometimes within her own community. And the book used to be longer. It used to go back and forth between Will and Rina POV chapters. And there was a part of the story before I revised it, more towards the end, Will goes to Boyle Heights. It used to be a very Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles and has for a long time been a very Latino neighborhood. And he does this series of paintings. He's an artist on invisible women. And he doesn't do it for profit or fame. He gives the portraits to the women, but he has learned to see women in the world that he never saw before because he had this relationship with Rina. And so in the copy of the book that never made it to readers' hands, there was like a finer point on that idea.
I think one of the things that really struck me reading the book was how you create the tedium of Rina's life, partly just according to the calendar of the Jewish observance and holidays and Shabbat. I never worried so much about bleaching my sink as reading how many times Rina is bleaching her sink and putting lotion on her hands. So there's that busyness. I think, she makes 15 kinds of cakes for whatever holiday. You really show a lot of that tedium. And then she meets Will and also her art, which is how she meets Will. Those kind of exist outside of that tedium and outside of that busyness. So I was hoping to just ask you a little bit about art and writing in your own life and how that sits alongside the busyness and tedium of the everyday.
It's evolved over time. When I wrote this book, and I'm a person, I think this is common to writers, who's sort of always been writing compulsively since I was a very small child. Not always for publication, not always for profit, but always been writing. And I wrote this book wrote and edited over about the course of a decade. And I raised 3 young children in that time, although primarily 2. By the time I was going out to agents, I had a 3rd child who was very young. There's a big spread in my children. And this book was written in, I think, an interesting way. And I'm always hesitant to give advice when other writers say, what's your writing schedule? Because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, a writer writes every day. That's what a writer does. Or you got to wake up early before your family. And none of those things worked for me. And for a while, I was a single mother between my marriages. And I would have these very sad weekends where I didn't have custody of my children. At first, really sad, and then later on, a little bit liberating. And I was working full time and putting food on the table. And so sometimes on these weekends, I would take a day off from work and drive up the coast to this tiny town of Cambria, California. It's in the acknowledgments of my book. I owe the town so much. And take out an extraordinarily cheap hotel room, motel, really. Like this whole town is built for ocean views. And I could afford like the one room where you had to like look way around the corner to see a tiny sliver of the ocean. And I would take a walk in the morning and a walk in the evening and like eat peanut butter off a spoon and write or edit for 8 hours a day. And that is how the bulk of the work happened for this book. Obviously, I wrote and edited at times in between. You can't, or I couldn't produce a whole manuscript that way, but that is how a lot of the work got done. I had to carve out that time very specially for myself, and walking, as it is for many people, is extremely generative. For me, I write a lot of my first drafts in my head as I take walks. So it was a good method. That's not how I'm writing now. I have a different life now. I can afford a slightly better room when I go to Cambria, can see the full ocean. And my youngest is 7 years old. I still work full time. I'm a Jewish communal professional, and I'm writing now every night until book tour, at least. I'm writing my second book. I'm writing pages every night. So I guess my main outlook on how I work art into my life and the tedium is according to the way that it works best for me at any given time. The important thing and the critical thing for me is not actually about the production of art, but about mental well-being. And people who are compelled to write or create art in any way, I think often don't feel as well or as stable if they're not producing that art. And I'm definitely one of those people. So there's an element of, I think self-care has become a kind of corrupted phrase, but there's an element of taking care of myself in making sure that I have time to write. The way for my husband, if he doesn't, get up his endorphins by working out, he doesn't feel well. I do not share that with him. I like a walk, but I don't need exercise to feel well, but I do need to be creating.
Great. I wanted to drill down a little bit. Rina's husband, David, is preoccupied with the issue of agunot, of women whose husbands won't give them a divorce according to Jewish law. What was it about that issue that you wanted to bring into this novel?
Yeah, part of it is I just think that that's a drum that needs to be beat generally. And so I wanted it to be a part of the story. But the way it works mechanically in my story is to set up some of Rina's anomalies. Rina wants to be more liberated. Rina sometimes thinks she got the short end of the stick. I think it's up for debate how much she did and how much she's created her own reality. But she thinks her husband is too stringent in many ways, and she has moved away from belief in a higher power. And yet on this issue, she can't quite find her way to her husband's perspective. Her husband's perspective is that the community is not doing enough for these chained women, that it's not okay to leave it in the hands of the rabbis, and it's not okay just to boycott, for instance, the business of a man who won't give his wife a Jewish divorce. Again, that actually there has to be like communal level action and a change has to be made. And Rina, who grew up in the community, can't quite get there. She shares David's feelings that it's awful. Right. And that's one of the ways she changes in the story. Even as she grows apart from her husband, she really grows to understand in a different way the plight of the agunot as something that doesn't have to be fixed in time and of a certain way forever. And I think that's because many of the things that she thought had to be a certain way and fixed in time forever have shifted over the course of the story. Rina's story is often sad, but one of the upshots for her is that she finds her way to a better sense of justice on the issue of agunot. And it is not at the forefront of the story, but I really wanted it there. And then, there are all of these hero women in the world right now for the really in the most public way that I've seen in my lifetime, bringing the issue of agunot out of the shadows, more into the mainstream and getting results, including really meaningfully and powerfully with a sex strike. And so that's been unfolding as I've been promoting my book. And I've just in awe of these women. And also, again, the narrative is sort of corrupted with the sex strike. People keep saying, oh, well, of course that will eventually work. Or, somebody gets unchained from their marriage and they say, well, it's because the men were deprived. And nobody is talking about that the women were also deprived, and that women have desire, and that it might have been a big sacrifice for women to forego sex on Shabbat and after they've been to mikveh, and really any night. And so as I've watched the story unfold, I think, these themes, people just need to be writing and writing and writing about women's desire and agency.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about practice being a silo or a container and your own atheist beliefs, and yet that you're a practicing Jew. So pick that apart a little bit for us. How does that work for you in your life?
Right. So we could probably do a whole episode on that. But I definitely feel tethered to my people. And I use Jewish texts as a technology through which to filter my modern problems. For me, because I don't believe that God wrote any part of our narrative, or that a God exists to write it, doesn't take away that incredible value of our tradition and our texts and our method of analyzing texts. And I do appreciate many of the containers. At times, the Jewish calendar feels relentless to me, which is what I tried to portray in Rina. But it's also incredible and a very useful way for me and for the generations before me, and I hope the generations that come after, to order their lives. And I find meaning in the ritual. I find extraordinary meaning in kashrut, and the idea that we eat with intention and we don't just put things into our mouths and our bodies. We think about it, and it may not really relate directly to the genesis of kashrut or the way some of my neighbors practice kashrut, but for me, it's extraordinarily meaningful.
I wanted to read you a quote from your book and ask you a question. On page 193, you write about Rina. If it had been misery keeping her down, she'd have started a revolution, but it was loveliness that pinned her to the bed. It was not the misery of the world crushing her, but the overwhelming beauty. She could not get up from under the weight of hope and joy that flowed off people, even when everything was broken. I wanted to ask you, are you an optimist?
No, I'm not an optimist. But I'm a pessimist who lives a reasonably joyful life. I think it's a lot of work to stay focused on the joy. But part of my pessimism is about the utter inconsequentiality and uselessness of my tiny existence in like a sphere of being. And so then in that way, the only thing that matters is love and the potential ability to decrease suffering in some tiny way. Some people do it in a very large way, but the ability to decrease suffering for others. But I'm a pessimist in ways that I also think that it's pragmatic. I'm extremely pessimistic about our climate. I'm pessimistic about the state of politics and our ability to care for human beings in the country I live in, and with the recognition that we have tremendous privilege in this country. And not that problems are, it's not a competition between problems. Human suffering is human suffering. But I spend a lot of time thinking about human suffering. So in that way, I do think I'm a pessimist. But unlike Rina, beauty doesn't crush me. I do spend a lot of time thinking about beauty. Rina is overwhelmed by beauty in that scene, and I am often overwhelmed by beauty. But I don't share Rina's ability to not process it or to be crushed by it. In fact, I wish I had more time in my life to just go out in the world and be in the world and recognize what's beautiful. But for me, it won't surprise you to know, based on what I write, that I think love is extraordinarily beautiful, and it's something we ought to be holding on to.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was wonderful talking to you, and I hope everyone will go out and read Olive Days.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It is it's like a deep pleasure to be invited to talk about favorite books and impactful books. Whoever has this pleasure in their lives, I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Jessica Elisheva Emerson, discussing her new novel, Olive Days. You can find a link to the book and all the others we discussed in our show notes. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to subscribe and share with friends and family. You can also find us on Instagram at 5bookspod. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.